Leaders of countries or commanders of armies have had their hands on the tiller of history for centuries. Their choices, their actions, and their deaths have profound consequences.
We are thoroughly convinced the case has never been solved.
Many become legends, even in their own lifetime. But can we ever really know the person behind the legend? The reality behind the myth?
Myths in general, I think, abide because they speak to us about certain sorts of issues.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
All of these stories continue to be powerful because they tell us important things, not just about the world around us, but about ourselves.
These are the stories we need to hear and never forget. They are the myths and legends of some of history's most famous, or in some cases, infamous leaders.
His rendezvous with grim destiny begins a little after noontime as his plane lands in Dallas. Death is less than 1 short hour away.
November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. A telegenic 46-year-old man and his wife, elegant in a pink Chanel suit, are riding in an open convertible. The man is President John F. Kennedy, the woman, Jackie Kennedy. As the car passes the Texas School Book Depository building, shots ring out. Kennedy is hit. Mrs. Kennedy frantically moves towards her husband, nursing his head in her arms. Millions, now billions of people have watched the famous footage of the shooting, an assassination for the television age. Shortly after the president was declared dead at 1 p.m. local time, police arrested a single suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald. But his arrest immediately raised questions. Could one man have been responsible for gunning down one of the world's most powerful men? Or was a larger conspiracy at play?
I'm just a patsy. President.
As the police investigated the available evidence, the public looked for meaning in such a shocking event. Alternate theories quickly emerged, feeding into myths about the circumstances of JFK's assassination.
It just doesn't compute. We have this idea that the gravity of an event has to equal the gravity of the cause that causes it. You couldn't possibly have just a single shooter with a certain kind of personal grudge or psychopathology. There has to be a big thing behind this big effect.
Lee Harvey Oswald worked at the Texas School Book Depository, and it was from there, witnesses claim, that he had fired on the president. Oswald had been seen leaving the building and fitted the description of the assassin. Oswald shot a Dallas patrolman, Officer J.D. Tippit, with a pistol, before attempting to hide in a movie theater. He was arrested there, still carrying said pistol.
Did you fire that rifle? That's dispatches you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
Even after finding a high-powered rifle on the 6th floor of the book depository with Oswald's palm print on it, he continued to protest his innocence.
This is the elevator bringing Oswald out to go to the armored car where he was to be transported to the county jail.
2 days after his arrest, while the president's body lay in state, Oswald was being transferred to the county jail when Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, muscled his way through the police escort and shot Oswald dead on live television.
And then, of course, complete delirium and pandemonium breaks out.
Oswald so shockingly gunned down while in police custody, coupled with Kennedy's popularity as a president, further fueled the idea that there must have been more to the story than what was being shared by the authorities.
Conspiracy theory is always around significant world issues, and the JFK assassination is certainly a significant world issue.
When our political figures pass away, people kind of think of them as patriarchs or something, or matriarchs, depending on who it is. There was a tremendous amount of grief surrounding it, and so to work out their grief, people might turn to conspiracy theories to make the event seem less senseless.
To allay the nation's fears, President Lyndon Johnson ordered an investigation into the events surrounding the assassination.
I ask for your help and God's.
The subsequent investigation, unofficially known as the Warren Commission, after its chairman, Chief Justice Earl Warren, amassed evidence from 552 witnesses and considered ballistic data, medical evidence, audio recordings, and footage of the shooting. They concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole gunman. He had acted alone and was not part of a conspiracy. But this would not be the end of the matter.
Why are you still investigating the Kennedy assassination?
We are thoroughly convinced of the fact that the case has never been solved, that the Warren Commission report is basically a fairy story.
I think one of the things that makes JFK's assassination such fertile ground for conspiracy theorists is that the Warren Commission report that was thrown together pretty hastily after the assassination was filled with inconsistencies, errors of fact, contradictions, and so on.
Given that only 1/3 of the people, Americans at least, believed the Warren Commission report, it made it very easy to accept the conspiracy theories, right? If the official line you're given doesn't ring true, you will believe something else. And that has carried forward.
There were many alternate theories contributing to the myths surrounding who killed JFK. One was that the Soviet Union was involved. Lee Harvey Oswald had twice visited the Soviet Union and had married a Russian woman there.
Oswald had lived in Russia for a time, and it ends up being theorized that maybe the KGB was involved, the CIA was involved.
Or maybe, as another theory goes, the mafia were involved.
Racketeers have corrupted the authorities. In many localities, they have outgrown the authorities.
JFK's younger brother and U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was targeting organized crime and making life hard for the mob. Many of these theories rested on the notion that Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't have been the sole gunman.
The proof that people referred to when they claimed that there was more than one shooter included eyewitness testimony that involved hearing gunshots coming from different places.
I only heard it, and I looked up and saw a man running up this hill.
But as we know now, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable.
Another piece of evidence skeptics of the Warren Commission point to is Warren Commission Exhibit 399. The report found that Kennedy was struck by 2 bullets. It is the first of these that has caused the most controversy and is known as the single or magic bullet theory. It holds that the number and pattern of wounds on Kennedy and the Texas governor John Connally, who was also wounded, could not have been achieved with a single bullet. If the single bullet was false, then could there have been a second shooter?
So with more than one shooter, a report came out to suggest that actually there could be a bullet from the front of the car. So this kind of then suggested that there was a conspiracy involved.
The Warren Commission looked into the allegations, but concluded that neither Lee Harvey Oswald nor Jack Ruby was part of any conspiracy, domestic or foreign, to assassinate the president. Oswald, they concluded, acted alone.
But that narrative, again, involved one individual gunman. And that, I think, to many people just seemed too insignificant to be the real explanation of such a major world event.
One of the reasons for the growth of these myths was that the Warren Commission had seen evidence they hadn't shared with the public. The Zapruder film. 486 frames of 8mm footage were captured by dressmaker Abraham Zapruder. He was filming on a nearby grassy knoll when the president was shot.
Then I had another shot or two. I couldn't say what it was, one or two. And I saw his head practically open up, all blood and everything. And I kept on shooting. That's about all. I'm just sick.
He gave the film to police, who had it developed immediately. He also sold it to Life magazine, but withheld one frame. Frame 313 shows the exact moment when the bullet strikes the president's head. The Warren Commission saw the frame and could tell it had come from the direction of the school book depository building. But because of its graphic nature, the frame was kept secret for over a decade, helping to perpetuate the myths that surrounded the assassination. Congress undertook a further investigation in 1976, making its hearings and findings public. But the release of these government records neither quashed the public's belief in a conspiracy, nor did it lead to a greater trust in the government.
Well, the government's going to release a bunch of documents, and you might think, great, now we're going to get a whole bunch of new information. But the people that are dubious of the government just think these are more things to be dubious of.
And so, the conspiracy lives on. The mythologies that have grown around JFK's life and death are among the most well-known of the modern era. But the passage of time shows us that he was far from the first leader to be the subject of myth and mystery. Sometimes, figures spring from myths that are larger than life and tell of the greatness of leaders lost. None more so than a great leader who emerged in ancient Britain in the Dark Ages, King Arthur of Camelot. Britain 1,500 years ago was divided, lawless, leaderless. Legend has it that the man who drew the sword Excalibur, which had been magically placed within a stone, would unite the country. Gallant, honorable Arthur pulled the sword from the stone and became king, reigning from his legendary hall of Camelot. Arthur drew about him valiant knights, the Knights of the Round Table, who ventured on quests and sought the Holy Grail. After a long and prosperous reign, Arthur was mortally wounded in battle by his traitorous nephew Mordred. Arthur threw Excalibur into a sacred lake, where it was duly taken by the Lady of the Lake. King Arthur himself traveled to the mystical Isle of Avalon. He didn't die, but sleeps and will one day return. But was there a real man behind the myth?
With legends, like the legend of King Arthur, you have the merging of a very distant historical past, and legends are usually based on some element of historical reality. But at times, you're not getting all of the facts recorded in a logical or coherent way.
The Roman Empire occupied most of Great Britain from the 1st to the 4th century CE. It is after this, in a period known as the early medieval period or Dark Ages, that most scholars point to as the potential time of Arthur.
If there were a historical figure who is remembered to us as Arthur, he probably would have lived sometime after the Roman legions left Britain. So that would be sometime in the late 5th century, the early 6th century.
The first mention of Arthur by name is said to have been in a Welsh poem dated between the 6th and the 11th century, although he was only referred to as a warrior, not a king.
We have some early annals and chronicles which talk about figures, not always named, and not always named Arthur, by the way. But these figures are often said to have fought a great battle and won a battle in which basically they stemmed the rising tide of the Saxon horde coming over to fill the vacuum left by the Romans.
The history of the kings of Britain, written around 1136, is perhaps the most well-known early account of King Arthur and contains many of the story elements we now associate with the legend. King Arthur is depicted both as a fierce warrior and a noble king. In the absence of any definitive proof of Arthur's existence, historians have also suggested that Arthur may not have been one person, but a composite of several medieval heroes and warriors, a symbol of hope for those trying to survive in medieval Britain.
I'd love to believe Arthur is real, but I have no real evidence of that. But if we think of the entire Arthurian canon as this beautiful tapestry, this beautiful woven tapestry that has all these stories on it, and that there might be a few threads of that tapestry that are actually based in historical fact, I don't see any reason why there couldn't be more than one thread that is the hero that becomes who we remember as Arthur.
Perhaps the importance of the Arthurian legend is not whether Arthur himself lived or not, but what it tells us about how to survive in these dangerous, dark times.
And what it shows us, like all good legends should, is how a heroic man should act. So embedded within this very complex story, you get ideals of masculinity and femininity. So you can be exposed to the story and take away how you are to live.
And I think that these stories in particular, they challenge us in that way. And it makes us perhaps want to be those better selves, and certainly know that to do that, we have to be willing to strive in the face of certain loss and, at times, failure.
Whether there was a real King Arthur may be nice to know, but the myth has outgrown the man. And even where we know for a fact historical figures existed, sometimes the details of their stories take on a life of their own. Joan of Arc was undoubtedly a real person, a female leader amongst men at an unlikely moment in history. But parts of her story remain shrouded in myth and mystery.
Joan of Arc is an extraordinary figure. She is a French heroine. She is also one of the patron saints of France. She's born around about 1412, and she lives a very short but still alive.
Born to farmers in Domremy, Joan is only 17 years of age when she sets out from her home to meet and protect the Dauphin, the uncrowned King of France. Guided, as she claimed, by the voices of the Archangel Michael, St. Catherine of Alexandria, and St. Margaret, Joan believed it was her duty to help France in the fight against England.
This is during what we call the 100 Years' War. The English, from the time of the Normans, had possessions in France. And during this period, the French had been kind of pushed back. And so the Dauphin had not been able to go to Reims to be crowned king.
By 1429, the armies of King Henry VI were laying siege to Orléans, one of France's most heavily defended cities. The Dauphin, Charles, was directing the French defense from nearby Chinon, but the fight was going badly. If the city fell, Charles's chances of being crowned King of France were grim. Joan arrived at Charles's court. The Dauphin was disguised, but the girl, who had never seen him before, bowed to him and said, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." Angels and saints had appeared to her, she said, telling her to take charge of the French forces. Charles agreed to her request and gave her a suit of armor. With her battle standard of lilies, angels, and Jesus, Joan set out to Orléans.
Now, what gives her this role and this respect? Keep in mind, France is a very religious, very Catholic country, is Joan of Arc claims that from the age of 13, God is talking to her. And so a king would never listen to a silly young teenage girl, but he would if she says God is speaking through her.
Before her arrival, The siege of Orleans had lasted almost 7 months. Within 7 days of Joan of Arc's time on the battlefield, it was over. Many within France thought this was proof that she was indeed a divine savior. News quickly spread, and volunteers joined the French army, hoping to serve under the banner of the Maid of Orleans.
And what is extraordinary about Joan of Arc is the fact that she breaks through the boundaries of established feminine behaviour. This is quite radical. And in that sense, she is an outsider right from the very beginning because she's breaking down these boundaries.
Joan had other military successes, but in 1430, she was captured by forces loyal to the Duke of Burgundy, who was French but opposed to Charles. The Burgundians ransomed Joan to the English, who took her to their headquarters in Rouen. The English put Joan on trial, not for her military activities, but for heresy.
Walking around at this time claiming you're hearing voices is a very vulnerable position to put yourself in, because if you're popular, it's God, and if you're unpopular, it's the devil.
The voices she heard, Joan insisted, were saints and possibly even God. And this, in the eyes of the church, was heresy. Joan was sentenced to death and burned at the stake on the 30th of May, 1431. She was 19 years old. Much of her life quickly became a mix of fact and myth. The most heavily debated aspects relating to the nature of the voices and premonitions Joan described during her life.
Whether or not her voices were real, in the sense of whether or not they were actually disembodied voices from heaven. To me, Joan of Arc is an important figure because of what she accomplished.
Modern medicine has offered other explanations for Joan's voices.
If you look at the case of having these voices, today a medical practitioner might diagnose her as having epilepsy. A psychiatrist may diagnose her as having a form of psychosis that manifests in visual and auditory hallucinations.
24 years after her execution, Joan was retried by another ecclesiastical court, this time one loyal to Joan's patron, now King of France. They overturned the heresy verdict.
The thing about Joan of Arc is, from the time she dies, almost immediately we see that she's embraced even more than she was in life. She was an icon during her lifetime, but then she almost becomes more of an icon, more of a symbol of France and French independence and fortitude and spirituality. Joan comes to represent all of that.
Over 500 years later, in 1920, Joan was canonized as a patron saint of France by Pope Benedict XV. Circumstances around Joan of Arc's life and death, her faith in religion and God, have made her, at times, a heretic, an icon, and a saint. Hundreds of years later, in another war that would sweep across Europe, the circumstances of the life and death of another historical female figure would also lead to speculation and myth-making. A princess at the world's most opulent royal court at the turn of the 20th century, the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia led a charmed life. Born to one of the richest men in the history of the world, her future of comfort and prosperity was seemingly assured. Her father, Nicholas II, was the Tsar of Russia and the head of the Romanov Empire, a lineage that had begun 3 centuries earlier. But with the outbreak of World War I and Russia's disastrous involvement in it, the public began to show how they felt.
There were multiple problems for the Romanov families in relation to the war. And Nicholas II had a very personal idea about what power meant. He represented himself as the sole, undivided head of state. And he reiterated that when in August 1915, he actually took charge of the armed forces. So he became the symbolic head of the military. Now, that is a very risky move because while he's using his God-given power and rights to sort of assert his authority over the empire in a time of crisis, it also means that when the war goes badly, and boy, does the war go badly, then he himself is liable to personal blame.
The truly staggering losses by Russia's ill-equipped army, coupled with the terrible food and fuel shortages, highlighted just how disconnected the Tsar was from his subjects. And with the Tsar's refusal to cede significant authority to the Duma, the Russian parliament, revolution was in the air. In March 1917, with rioting in St. Petersburg and with the army's support evaporating, Nicholas was forced to abdicate. This would be known as the February Revolution.
After Nicholas II had abdicated and he finally returned to the summer palace where his wife and children were living after the February Revolution, they were then moved in the summer to Tobolsk, which is in western Siberia. But then finally they were then moved to Yekaterinburg, and this was after the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917. And from then on, their fate became extremely unpleasant, really.
What happened in the Russian royal family's final residence in Yekaterinburg is the source of the myths surrounding Princess Anastasia. In the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918, the Tsar's family and their servants were woken by the guards and taken to the basement. The family was told that the Bolshevik government had ordered their execution. The guards immediately shot and killed the family, using guns and bayonets. The bodies were stripped and buried in unmarked graves in the forest. However, rumors persisted that one or more of the Romanov family had escaped execution. Speculation was deliberately fueled by the new government, who did not want to reveal the truth of the killings. The most common myth was that the Tsar's youngest daughter, 17-year-old Anastasia, had somehow escaped. In the years following the demise of the Romanovs, multiple women came forward claiming to be Princess Anastasia. Most famously, in the early 1920s, one Anna Anderson. Anna claimed she had been wounded when her royal parents and siblings were killed, and that she had pretended to be dead and so escaped. This captured the imagination of the entire world, and for decades, many hoped and believed it to be true. But courts assessing her legal claim did not agree that she was the Princess Anastasia. In the 1990s and early 2000s, all Romanovs' burial locations were finally discovered and excavated. When the bodies were DNA tested, all family members were there. Anastasia, too. She had not escaped, but was killed in the basement, along with her parents and 4 siblings in 1918. While history has shown us that Anastasia did die, the myth of her miraculous escape has persisted for many years. Perhaps this speculation helped to dull the horror of an entire family being cruelly murdered. 20 years after the demise of the Romanovs, another world war would engulf the globe, leading to another myth, this time underpinned by the fear that a reviled leader had somehow survived. April 1945, Berlin. As the Allied armies were closing in on the city, Hitler and Eva Braun slipped out of the Führer bunker, leaving behind decoy dead bodies for the advancing Russian army to find. They made their escape by plane, or, in the more dramatic version of the tale, left in a submarine loaded with gold. Hitler and Braun would go on to have children together, and the Führer lived to the age of 73.
Frankly, there are lots of great stories about Hitler's survival and how he escapes. There's one account that has a pilot landing on a street in Berlin and a little Fiedler Stork aircraft. Hitler hops on board and off they fly to an airfield in northern Germany where they get on a big plane that takes them to Greenland. And that eventually gets him on a submarine, which takes him all the way down to Buenos Aires or somewhere in Argentina, where he supposedly spends the rest of his days, living in hiding, planning a Fourth Reich.
We can trace the origins of this myth to June 1945, when Stalin and other Soviet officials speculated that Hitler was either living in Spain or Argentina. This was backed up by the Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who said that despite earlier reports that the Red Army had discovered Hitler's remains in the grounds of the Führer bunker, Russian soldiers had not in fact removed Hitler's body.
The entrance to Hitler's air raid shelter. It was just outside that the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun are said to have been destroyed. The Germans said petrol was poured over their bodies and they were burnt. It might be true, it might not.
You've got to imagine the immediate aftermath of the war in Europe. You've got Berlin in rubble, you've got Germany in chaos. There are soldiers, refugees, prisoners of war, spies. It's a chaotic situation. And it suits Stalin really well to make out that the West, the Western powers, are hiding Hitler. It's going to make it look as though the West are complicit with fascism.
The uncertainty over whether Hitler was really dead was enough to prompt British and American intelligence agencies to mount their own investigations. The British gave the task to an intelligence officer, Hugh Trevor Roper, who drew on interviews with the staff of the Führer bunker and senior Nazi officials who witnessed the events of April 1945.
What is very well documented by numerous accounts is, as Berlin was being ever encircled by the Soviet Red Army, is that Hitler's mental state, frankly, was not good. He was, incandescent with rage half the time, or he was very melancholy. He was out of control, and he really genuinely believed that the German people didn't deserve him.
From his investigation, Trevor Roper concluded that Hitler and Braun had secretly married on the 29th of April, and Hitler had drawn up his last will and testament. The following day, April the 30th, at a little after 3 p.m., he and Braun swallowed cyanide capsules, and Hitler shot himself in the head. SS officers took the two dead bodies outside, wrapped them in a swastika flag, doused them in petrol, and set them alight. The bodies were only partially burned, so the soldiers buried the remains in the Chancellery grounds. In 1999, excavations took place in Berlin to uncover the remains of the Führer bunker.
They're silently digging up Hitler's bunker, the sand-filled remains of the bottom 17 rooms. The place where Adolf Hitler committed suicide is being exposed right now.
The discovery of Hitler's marriage record and will confirmed that Hitler's last days had happened as Trevor Roper had concluded. Although the Russians had taken key evidence from the Chancellery burial site, there was still ample evidence that Hitler was dead.
Well, there are two really important supporting pieces of evidence. The first are simply the overwhelming amount of eyewitness testimony that talks about burning Hitler's body. If you're burning Hitler's body, that does mean that Hitler is dead. Secondly, there are also some remains of his jawbone in the Moscow archives. Now, that jawbone has had a proper dental identification. It's been matched with Hitler's dental records. It's got a very distinctive bridge, a telephone bridge as it's known, between two of the molars, and that is identical to what you see in Hitler's dental records. So, if Hitler survived, he's missing most of his mouth and indeed most of his head. So obviously he's dead.
Eventually, In 1973, a Norwegian team was given access by the USSR to the dental remains. Not only was there a perfect match between the remains and Hitler's dental records, but also the teeth showed evidence of having been exposed to cyanide, as witness accounts of Hitler's death claimed. But despite the evidence, the myth that Hitler got away persists. For decades, authorities received reports from people claiming to have seen Hitler, or even be Hitler.
There is a lot of nonsense, even today, that says that Hitler survived the Second World War and somehow escaped. Often, the story goes he went to Argentina. It's all nonsense. And it's, the product of either junk historians or fantasists, or both.
Because of the manufactured uncertainty, Hitler's death certificate was only issued in 1956. While it has been proven that Hitler definitely died, the inevitable disorder and instability at the end of this global conflict fueled speculation that transformed into myth. This was also the case in the febrile atmosphere of the Cold War and the myths that surround the unexpected and unexplained death of a prime minister. In 1986, Olof Palme was Sweden's prime minister and head of its left-leaning Social Democratic Party. He was in his second term as the country's prime minister. On February 28th, Palme and his wife Lisbeth caught the subway into central Stockholm to meet their son and his girlfriend to see a film together. After the film, they went their separate ways. Before midnight, Palme and his wife were walking home when an assassin shot Palme from behind, fatally wounding him. Lisbeth was also wounded. A taxi driver saw the attack and the murderer running from the scene. Police came quickly, but the assassin escaped. Just after midnight, Palme was declared dead.
Olof Palme didn't have security detail that night because he quite often didn't, even if he was going out late at night, because part of his identity as Prime Minister was a man of the people, and he didn't like having security people between him and the Swedish people.
This sort of violent crime just didn't happen in Sweden, so Stockholm police had very little experience handling such a high-profile incident.
The initial stages of the investigation were botched. They didn't manage to close the city off. They didn't manage to search the streets, although they have a system for doing so. The scene was sort of trampled and improperly taken care of. And I think there was just total panic because it seemed so unlikely that something like that could happen in Sweden.
The failure to find the killer, coupled with Palme's international profile, left a news vacuum, which was quickly filled by speculation.
There are several theories around the death of Olof Palme, some of which are more credible than others, and the popular ones are that there was some connection with South Africa because Olof Palme was very critical of apartheid and donated to Mandela's ANC.
In charge of Sweden's biggest murder hunt, Stockholm's police chief Hans Holmer, who told the world's press today he had no hot clues.
No, it's the typical situation for the moment when you start a big murder case like this. You have to be patient and impatient in a sort of mixture.
And then there was a series of culprits that they identified who were quite random, really. They started looking at the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, for no particular reason. And then after that, they identified a local alcoholic who they thought could have been near the scene at the time. But again, there was no forensic evidence at any point. It was just kind of them casting around, looking for anybody who could fit the profile.
After interviewing more than 10,000 people and investigating 4,000 vehicles, police in 2020 announced that they were reasonably confident that they had found their lone assassin.
It took the police until 2020 to name Stig Engström as the likely suspect because there was so little forensic evidence for them to go back to. They had no weapon, they had no real idea of a motive. So they've been working on it on and off for decades now. And I think it reached the point where they felt they had to have an official solution.
Engström worked at the Skandia Insurance Company and had been vocally critical of the Prime Minister. His alibi for the night in question was weak, and he fitted the description witnesses gave of the killer.
There's still no motive that's been presented for Stig Engström, but it's the best they can do. So they kind of have to just go with it because it is unacceptable to have this open wound in society where their Prime Minister was murdered and they don't know who did it.
The investigation into Olof Palme's death was finally closed in 2020 after 34 years. But Engström had escaped justice. He had died by suicide in the year 2000.
It's this great unsolved mystery and such an un-Swedish thing to have happened. And for somebody to have come out of nowhere and killed the Prime Minister is sort of unthinkable still, even though they've known it for 30 years.
Our fascination with myth-making around our leaders is not limited to specific individuals. Imagine a myth so insidious, so all-consuming, that it connects world leaders throughout history. One that poses the possibility that the leaders we know and have elected are not actually in charge. Who is really pulling the levers behind everything? Is there a powerful cabal controlling governments around the world? Puppet masters behind the political curtain? That is the premise of the Illuminati myth, that there is a secret society whose members hold positions of power and are masterminding world events.
The Illuminati, which people may not realise, is actually a real group that existed 250 years ago. It was the late 1700s, and their goal really was to take over the world. They were there to try and mess things up with the monarchy, really kind of push their own agenda.
The Illuminati was established in 1776 in Bavaria, southeastern Germany. Publicly, the Illuminati was a charitable and philanthropic organization. Some of the members were admitted to the order's secret to gain power over religious and governmental institutions by putting Illuminatus in charge. The society, like many cults, was very hierarchical, with a single leader at the top of the pyramid, a law professor named Adam Weishaupt.
Initially, it was just a small handful of them that met on a regular basis, but their numbers eventually grew. And they thought that Christianity is a problem, right? It's a problem in the way that it influences governments.
It is estimated that a number of prominent, wealthy figures, including ministers, doctors, lawyers, and noblemen, were Illuminatus, perhaps as many as 2,000 in German-speaking states. They were often recruited from, and sometimes in concert with, another secret society, the Freemasons.
So in promoting the Illuminati story, Weishaupt also mentioned the Freemason, and he said that people who were in his organization should also be Freemasons, and so that's the connection to the Freemasons. So in both cases, you have sort of secretive fraternal organizations, and they sort of split off.
The order of the Illuminati was, in reality, surprisingly short-lived. Following pressure from the Catholic Church, the Illuminati, along with other secret societies, were outlawed in Bavaria in 1785. Yet the myth of the all-powerful Illuminati persisted. By 1797, 8 years after the French Revolution, conservative thinkers John Robeson and the ex-Jesuit Abbé Augustin Barruel put forward the idea that the Illuminati were responsible for the conflict. The two authors pushed the myth even further, describing how the Illuminati were now responsible for an international conspiracy to overthrow established governments and religions. This idea spread to the United States. In 1798, former US President George Washington, who was known to be a Freemason, also worried about the possible influence of the Illuminati. He wrote to a colleague that the Illuminati had a nefarious and dangerous plan to overthrow the government and put its members in power. A popular symbol associated with the Illuminati is that of the Eye of Providence. The eye, surrounded by a triangle and rays of light, is featured on the reverse side of the Great Seal of the United States and was used to illustrate being watched over by God.
You can mistake anything as evidence of the Illuminati. If you believe that the Illuminati is still existing today and controlling world events, then you can point to any given world event and say, they did that.
In the absence of irrefutable proof that they don't exist, the Illuminati remains a pervasive myth even to this day. The myth of a secret, all-powerful society pulling the strings also persists under a new name, the New World Order.
The Illuminati conspiracy morphed into the New World Order conspiracy theory pretty easily because they both involve this general idea that there's a pervasive evil force that's controlling everything.
The right-wing theory goes that a global cabal of Jews and atheists are using the United Nations and the banking system to overthrow Christianity and democratically elected leaders and install a global totalitarian government, a new world order.
The contemporary myth of the Illuminati is that the Illuminati is this group of powerful businessmen that control everything, that they've served to bring about a new world order, and that they're behind most of the recent historical events, that they're behind 9/11, that they're behind Watergate.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
That they're behind the Kennedy assassination and so forth.
One of the reasons why, of course, it's so evocative, why people still talk about it, the fictional Illuminati and the original one, was that people want to know what's behind the curtain. People are inherently drawn to conspiracies. We want to be in the know.
History's leaders changed the global map and the way we live our lives, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The people who shaped those events become larger than life.
These stories last for generations and generations, centuries, sometimes millennia. Why is that? Because it's a good story that tells us something that we need to hear.
Leaders from history inevitably become the stuff of legend because it's our only way of rationalizing their dramatic rise and fall and the impact, both good and evil, they have had on all our lives, whose mythologies outlive their real influence and actions, and whose legend remains with us despite the passing of time.